Turning to trending news out of the U.S. now, former U.S. President former Donald Trump loyalist Sidney Powell has pleaded guilty in the Georgia elections case. Fulton County prosecutors are recommending she gets 6 years probation. In return, she has to testify in future trials, perhaps including the former president's. Powell is admitting she had a role in breaching election systems in a rural Georgia county in 2021 in an effort to overturn Trump's 2020 loss in that state. Her guilty plea being called significant by experts.
You understand that the state is asking that a $6,000 fine be imposed, a restitution of $2,700 be paid to the state of Georgia, an apology letter be written to the citizens of the state of Georgia, that you truthfully testify at all hearings and proceedings and trials involving the co-defendants in this matter, and that you have no communication with co-defendants, media, or witnesses until this case has been completely closed against all defendants.
I do.
Donald Trump's ex-lawyer in an Atlanta courtroom today pleading guilty to 6 misdemeanors, accusing her of conspiring to intentionally interfere with the performance of election duties.
Do you understand that the recommendation being made to the court as to this accusation on counts 1 through 6 that you be sentenced to 12 months of probation to run consecutive with one another?
I do.
Sidney Powell will serve 6 years of probation and has agreed to testify truthfully against her co-defendants at future trials. She was charged alongside the Republican ex-president and 17 others with violating the state's anti-racketeering law. She's now the second person to plead guilty. Bail bondsman Scott Hall pleaded guilty last month and agreed to testify at future trials. Powell's last-second plea drastically changes the trial that was supposed to begin tomorrow. Jury selection was supposed to begin for a trial of her and co-defendant Kenneth Chesebro. They both invoked their rights to a speedy trial and became the first courtroom showdown in this sprawling case. But it now appears that Chesebro will move forward on his own. He's pleaded not guilty to 7 crimes related to his role in the fake electors plot. Experts say Powell's guilty plea today is a significant win for the district attorney prosecuting the former president and others.
It can set and run an algorithm that probably ran all over the country to take a certain percentage of votes from President Trump and flip them to President Biden.
Powell strenuously pushed baseless conspiracy theories that the 2020 election in Georgia was stolen from Trump and filed a litany of failed lawsuits challenging the results.
Most of us there knew something very wrong had happened. It was obvious to me from the mathematical and statistical impossibilities that occurred the night of our election.
What remains unclear is how high up in the Trump campaign Powell's actions were known, and whether she will implicate co-defendants such as former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani or Trump himself when she eventually testifies. So how exactly does Powell's admission of guilt impact former President Trump? We're joined by attorney Vicki Podberesky. Vicki, what does that mean for him? How will it affect his case in Georgia going forward?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. So it's going to be very interesting because Sidney Powell's plea is probably one of the more interesting pleas I would think that's going to happen in the case. And she has been described as an architect of the plan to undercut the vote. I would think that it'll be interesting to see what happens and who she's going to testify against. It's a bit of a sticky wicket when you get a lawyer to cooperate, because then you get into a bit of a morass with attorney-client privilege and work product privileges. And so I think looking forward to how the Georgia prosecution team uses her will tell us whether they're going to use her in ways of defendants just above her in the complaint to see if she's going to get them to possibly turn on former President Trump, or they're going to try and claim some kind of crime fraud exception, allow her to testify directly against former President Trump. And that should be very interesting because I'm sure she's been privy to many meetings and has many memorandums and documents that would be illuminating for the strategy that was orchestrated here.
The Georgia case has been called different and more damning than the other federal cases levied against Trump. Can you explain how a state indictment differs from a federal indictment?
So the state indictment here, of course, focuses on state crimes. The interesting thing about the Georgia state case and the federal case that's against former President Trump in Washington, D.C., is that the Georgia case almost sits like the foundation in some ways for the federal indictment, because at its core, the federal indictment is about using one's power and conspiring in a way to undercut a constitutional right to have your vote counted. And the way that was accomplished is best exemplified in the Georgia case, because right there you see in a whole sort of RICO type conspiracy how each player had a role in undermining an individual's vote in Georgia to try and undercut the entire election. And if Georgia were to succeed, which it obviously is doing because the Georgia prosecution team is starting to get guilty pleas, that's going to help, I think, the Washington, D.C. prosecution and federal court to lay the foundation for how January 6th was sort of the pinnacle of what former President Trump designed to happen.
All this is happening as Trump campaigns to become president again. Is there any way the numerous ongoing legal cases against him could prevent that from happening?
You know, I unfortunately think not. I think that whether he's facing indictment or former President Trump actually gets convicted, he can still run and serve as president from what I understand of our constitutional law. And therefore, it becomes really a question of our country's moral fabric. Do we want to have somebody as president of the United States with a background in fraudulent conduct and lack of credibility? And I think as a country, this is me personally now saying this really becomes a test of sort of the moral fabric of the country and who do we want representing us. And while there's a huge base for former President Trump, I think ultimately indictments and potentially convictions are going to hurt his chances of being reelected.
Thank you so much for joining us and breaking this down, Vicki.
Thank you. Much appreciated.